Hey, welcome to the show today, everybody. My name is Mike Phillips. I'll be your host. This is the Leadership Toolkit, as you know, the definitive leadership podcast, so that you can learn awesome stuff from many awesome people in different verticals of business. We get into conversations and talk about what it is to win in leadership, sometimes what it is to lose or fail in leadership, and what you can learn from it. And my whole goal of the show certainly is to provide value to you, the audience, so that you can grow yourself and you can grow your team, you can grow your company and organization and all of the people that are around you. I'm very excited today to have my guest Jeff today with me. He's the CEO of iBridged. He's really passionate about helping leaders. It's interesting. He and I connected a little bit ago, and kind of a mutual connection said, "Oh, Jeff would be awesome. Have him on your show." It's Jeff Harnois or Harnois. I'll get him to clarify the last name. I've just referred to him as Jeff all this time, so I realized. But I'm going to bring him on because one of the cool things, he tuned into the podcast and was watching a show with another good friend of mine. He says, "Hey, you posed this question of how do you measure trust and how do you measure some of these intangibles in leadership?" And he says, "I got a way to do that. Do you want to talk?" And I was like, "Heck yeah, I want to talk. That's awesome." So I bring to you today my new friend, Jeff Harnois. Is that correct? Am I saying that right?
That's really close, Mike. Thanks for
Okay.
asking. In France, it's pronounced Arnois.
Harnois.
The Anglo version is Harnois.
Okay. Well, I will. And here's the irony of this. That's the one thing I meant to ask before we started to go live, because I think it's something that's really important. My buddy Ben, who as a master of names, it's funny, he has a leadership channel and he talks about how important names are on several of his videos. And I thought to myself this morning, that was the one thing I wanted to ask. And then, so that our audience knows, we had some technical difficulties and we're trying to go live. And I said, "Okay, let's go." Because every time you and I had talked, we've talked a couple of times now, it's just been Jeff and Mike. So
Hmm.
that's what we're going to have today, is we're just going to have a conversation with Jeff and Mike, which I'm super excited. So your company is iBridged,
That's right.
and you do have some really cool things, from talking about psychometrics and
Hmm.
Myers-Briggs and DiSC, and then, like I said, your direct comment to me when we were talking, you said, I was talking, I think it was about Ian, about trust,
Hmm.
and you said, "I've got a way we can do that." And
Hmm.
let's get on a show and talk about it. So that's how we ended up here. So if you would, Jeff, please do me a favor and share with our audience kind of who you are, what your background is, what your leadership experience is, and let's chat, man.
Yeah, what a great open. Thank you, Mike. From a background standpoint, I'm the first person in my family of thousands to go to college. Come from a very blue collar background where education wasn't necessarily prized. So kind of dug in deep and eventually wound up with a graduate level degree in organization development. Professionally, started my career as an individual contributor back in the early days of Apple, and learned a ton about people and progress and really vision and how to operationalize around that. Moved to another Fortune 50 company as the VP of sales for the technology division. Went on to co-found a couple of startups, sort of in and out of corporate America, but ultimately managing my own career from individual contributor to the C-suite. One of the early components, or let's say programs, that I had access to in those early days at Apple was a psychometric called Myers-Briggs. And that assessment in particular was like a lightning rod going through my soul. Um,
Hmm.
I learned so much about my communication style, my decision making style, how I show up in conflict, how I communicate. What I really learned was where I'm really good in communication and where I have blind spots in relation to others. My wife also, who was at Apple at the time, had access to the same assessment, and we discovered that we were not the same person and the same personality. And what we learned from that was, how to better connect, how to better communicate, how to better operate together. And in February, it'll be 40 years together.
Wow,
So
congratulations.
yeah, thanks so much. And so it's sort of that arc of, from startups to Fortune 50 organizations to mid-level organizations, really understanding what it looks like to help teams and people perform at a higher level.
Oh, that's fantastic. And forgive me, I'm taking notes here as well. So let me pull back over here. So when you're talking about helping teams perform at a higher level, one of the unique things, as I look at my notes here, it says you really gain a lot of actionable insights. When you were saying Myers-Briggs, now do you still utilize like the Myers-Briggs and DiSC models and so forth, or you have your own sort of proprietary sauce? How do you when you're looking at leadership, what's the first approach? Somebody comes to your company and says, "Hey, Jeff, we want to be able to measure these things." How do you start to approach that right at the very beginning? And thanks again for joining me, man.
I'm so pleased to be here. It's an honor, Mike. Thanks so much for having me. I have to tell you that the leadership problem or question really begins at that initial engagement with the client to understand, what is the problem? What problem are you trying to solve? What are your challenges? I also like to understand a little bit of what remedies have you tried previously? How did they work? Where were they effective? Where did they have gaps? But really narrowing in on what the issue is. And foundationally, what we see is that there's a very small investment in leadership development for people who lead, multi-million to multi-billion-dollar organizations.
Sure.
There's sort of this assumption that, wow, they've had some success, so we're going to put them in charge of this team, and we'll see a replication of that success. And then what the leaders often do is they think, well, this is what worked for me before, so I'm going to go ahead and bring that forward again. And what we see often is a huge disconnection between them and their teams. So we start with a psychometric assessment, and I'll answer your questions about which ones we use in a second.
Sure.
With a psychometric assessment, but then again, we're sort of interested in, is there some behavioral issues, either with the leader or with the team and team dynamics, that are compromising things like trust? Do they have the ability to engage in conflict in a healthy way? Are they making commitments to outcomes and how we're going to work together, as an example? Is there accountability? We often find when we assess teams that accountability is singularly the lowest scoring of the attributes. And then ultimately, are we focusing on collective results? So with iBridged, we have a couple of distinct audiences. One is individuals who are generally in leadership level roles who are working on managing their career.
Okay.
With those folks, we have a tendency to use Myers-Briggs, which is a 4-dimensional psychometric. It takes a little more work to understand the modeling, and then more importantly, to operationalize it. With teams, we typically use a product called Everything DiSC from Wiley, and that's in conjunction with a couple of other programs that we'll implement. But in all cases, the psychometric assessment gives us a really, really important insight into the individual and to the team dynamics.
That all of this stuff it's so intriguing to me, and I part of the reason I look down here sometimes, I try really hard to keep eye contact, because that's one of those things that I'm like listening and I'm processing, but I gotta take notes, man, because there's so much cool stuff. And it's interesting, Ben, when we get into these psychological evaluations, and like it's who you are at your core. Ben here says, hey, when he's an ENTJ. I had to bend over and grab my book here. I have the whole thing. Well, they can't see it on screen, but I could say it on the podcast. I'm an ESFJ, the console, right, which is like the servant leader type of deal. So let me ask you a question, just kind of a side note here. Do you see people, when it comes to Myers-Briggs or when it comes to DiSC, do you see them change over time, or are they pretty much what they are?
Yeah, that's a really good question. The top line modeling that I typically use is nature and nurture. So
Okay.
the nature component is who were you when you were born, and whatever it was that created the individual who you are. And then the nurture component is, what were the environmental factors that may shape who you've become. In addition to that, when we look at the need for the organization, within an organization, who do you need to be? How do you need to show up? And that also then can influence. I want to give you a really specific example because it's so interesting to me.
Sure.
We did an assessment. This is with a C-suite large software company out here in the Bay Area. The chief people officer, when we assessed her as a member of the team, she showed up as an ID in the DiSC modeling. We can talk about that a bit more as well. But then when we assessed her as a leader of her team, the team that she manages, she shows up as a DI. And so the assessment instrumentation is sensitive enough to pick up on those subtle differences based on what the environmental aspects are demanding of you.
It's interesting because in business, I've had a lot of conversations where like, and part of the reason I asked that question is because so often as humans, like we think, well, what you see is what you get. Like I am what I am, right? And here's who I am. And it's like, well, yeah, but are you the same person at home as you are at work, as you are in church, as you are at the grocery store?
Yeah.
And so it's interesting you bring that up, that it's like, well, you have these different dominant traits, right? And I'm no expert on DiSC. I'm a little bit familiar when you start talking about the stuff there and the different traits. But it's interesting that how you're saying like, well, they flip flop, right? There's a different way that she shows up for her team and so forth.
Yeah.
Let me ask you another question, because you brought up a few things, and I was again just taking notes here. When we're talking about the accountability issues or behavioral issues or trust issues, because it seems like you're saying, hey, a lot of them we show up for the leadership, and we're measuring this. It sounds like more top down rather than from the employee up. And you could correct me when I'm wrong. It sounds like you do it probably both ways, but that's sort of your initial interaction. What happens when you start to measure these things and somebody says to you, because you said you ask questions, which I think anybody taking notes, and if you're listening on the podcast, it's really, really important to take that note. Anytime you're coming in as a third party, like maybe as Jeff is, as a consultant, if you're coming in as a new leader, I think that's all. And I've had many people say that on the show, Jeff, like it's so important for the first step to be to ask questions and listen.
Yeah.
You're not diving right in to just say, well, here's the assessment.
Sorry,
go ahead.
The modeling, Mike, along that line is diagnose before you prescribe. And as a consultant, you must understand what the problem is. And I want to be clear about this. Oftentimes when we're talking to clients, what we're hearing when we say, well, what's the problem, are actually symptoms, right?
Sure.
And so we've got to dig deeper to get back to what's the root cause here? What's really causing the symptoms that you're seeing or that you're experiencing? And then we also do a little bit of shaping, like, what's your goal here? What would you like to see out of this individual or out of this team? That then gives us a sort of a clear direction, if you will, and a clear target of where we're going together.
Do you find it often, and I'm going to bring us back down, but do you find it often that, like, when you're saying, hey, what's the clear goal? What's the thing that you want out of this individual as a leader? Do you find that sometimes the company or the organization, somebody that's higher up than the person that is the titled leader, can't articulate that well, so the leader doesn't know where they're going?
Yeah, we get that every once in a while. There are a couple of dynamics here that are interesting. One, moving upward in the organization, they can't clearly articulate what the problem is. And so our engagement is to do just that, go get clarity on what the real problem is. And oftentimes sending that information back up in the organization, again, adds so much clarity to the thinking and the decision-making that follows. So doing that assessment, getting clear on root causes is a normal, natural step. The other issue, the other dynamic is sometimes we hear, this is the problem, but when we get into it, it's actually something else.
That happens a lot in life.
Mm-hmm.
So let me ask you another question, because one of the things, if you're going in and assessing the leader and you're looking at the leadership, and you commented earlier, hey, if it's something behavioral with the leader, or if it's something behavioral or with the staff in the organization, what if you do find out that there's a problem or a concern with the leader? And this would be for anybody. So this is maybe a little bit of a broad question, but I think you really will be able to answer this well and give some good advice. if someone is going in, if they're in, an executive leadership role and they're talking to one of their managers, one of their leaders, or you're the owner of an organization, you're inviting somebody like Jeff in as a consultant to say, hey, give us some advice. What is the approach? What is your advice to somebody if you find that the problem is with the person that is leading? What are 2 or 3 actions that they should start with?
From a prescriptive standpoint, it would really depend on what the issue is. So in terms of describing what they should do next there's a straight line correlation to what the actual issue is.
Okay.
But oftentimes we have to start with the awareness. I would say about 50% of the time, leaders that we work with are aware that they have a problem. They're maybe not completely clear on what's happening or why it's happening. And so we'll do that work with them to get clarity around that. Another half of the time, they're not aware of it at all. And so there's a coaching technique that we call holding up the mirror. And it's
Okay.
really allowing that leader to see the reflection of what's happening, and more importantly, what effect that's having on the folks that they're either leading or working with, or even just stakeholders. And that, for 90% of our clients, while it's uncomfortable, maybe even a little awkward, there's a deep appreciation for them now being able to see something that they couldn't see before. And that allows them that awareness to go up, and then we can move into a solutioning type of configuration. There's another 10% of those folks who are like, that's not a problem for me. That's not my problem. And we take a little bit of a different approach to those folks. But generally speaking, we're sort of experts at showing people things that they normally can't see for themselves without the help.
Sure. No, and I think that's one of the most important things as a leader. Oftentimes we need to be willing, when somebody's coming in, such as Jeff, or even if we have somebody that's in an executive level that's a peer, for them coming in and saying, hey, listen, you need to know this thing. Most of the time, if people are going to tell you on something that's uncomfortable, if you have a relationship with them, either a business relationship like this, or you have an established relationship, what I've found, and Jeff, you correct me if I'm wrong here, but most of the time, if we have a relationship, the people that are telling us the things are really telling us what we need to know, and not just what we want to hear, because they actually care about seeing us successful. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that. Let me just take that a step further, Mike.
Sure.
It seems to me that right now in the world today, so much chaos and so much instability and hyper volume of change, hyper velocity of change, and leaders and managers alike are looking for anything that they can find to help them gain control and command over their sphere of influence, to make them more effective at what they do. And oftentimes the insights that we provide are literally the key to open those doors.
That's phenomenal. On level leadership here, this is Tammy says, the identification of executive leadership blind spots is a key component to enabling change in leadership behavior. And I think that's something powerful that you offer, your company offers. And again, you have a different perspective because you're coming in from this position of strength and saying, hey, look, here's do you want me to tell you what you need to know or what you want to hear? Here's what you need to know if you want to change it. So hitting on a few of the topics, because you sent me an email prior to this discussion. And one thing I want to ask is you were talking about, like, when we're talking about psychometrics in leadership styles versus employee styles. You had this question sort of outlined here, and I think this is something your company does heavily. Leadership styles versus employee styles. What works and what doesn't? Is there a magic component? Like, is there a magic set of traits that is able to work together? Or when you're saying what works and what doesn't, give us a few insights into that. Like, what are a couple of things that work, and then what are a couple of things that really don't?
Yeah, and it's such a big question. Two things that I want to say going into this answer. The first thing is, when we talk about psychometrics, there is no right or wrong. There is no good and bad. There's no appropriate value assessment there.
Sure.
Because at the end of the day, we all possess a little bit of all of the traits. We just have preferences for others. And so we are able to operationalize traits that aren't ours, but we have a tendency to sort of amplify the ones that are ours. A good exercise that you can do to demonstrate exactly what I'm talking about is if you're right-handed, pick up the pen, put it in your left hand and sign your name and observe that experience. What you're going to find is it's awkward, it's uncomfortable. You have to slow down your mental processes. You have to think about something that you would normally just do automatically. Can you do it? Of course you can. Of course you can sign your name with your non-dominant hand. Is it going to look good? Probably not. But again, you can get it done. And that's what we teach leaders to do, is sort of understand your non-dominant traits and help sort of strengthen those to give you a little bit more balance. The second thing that we want to make sure that we do is we don't want to exclude people, or even include people for that matter, based on traits. That's generally not a wise thing to do, and can be pretty perilous in a lot of ways. So I wouldn't want to lean in the category for that as type to task. You have to be careful about trying to map people based on personality types with roles. So I want to park that there for a second. Now, in terms of being prescriptive around, are there certain traits that are better than others? The question that I always ask, and it always comes back to this, Mike, is what's needed? What's needed? So I'm going to use Myers-Briggs as an example here. I'm going to actually use something that you said in your type versus the first commenter on his ENTJ. Let's use the S and the N dichotomy. S is for sensing, N is for intuition. Those words don't necessarily mean anything here, but that's the dichotomy. You have an S, the commenter had an N. Your approach to leadership is often very focused on what's in front of you right now. You have a perpetual sense of urgency, and you're very driven to solve problems that are immediate and present in your world. I often frame this as leaders who are current state. You're very interested in what's happening right now. Your relationship with time is one-to-one. What's in front of you right now? People with an N preference have a tendency to be more future state in terms of their thinking and their orientation. They're often thinking about things that are more conceptual or theoretical. They often have a tendency to see the problem on a much bigger playing field and see other influences around that particular problem, whereas somebody with an S-type might just see the problem and go solve the problem. So I use a firefighter analogy all the time. If my house is on fire, who do I want? Do I want an S fireman or an N fireman? The S fireman is going to come in, they're going to see the problem, they're going to solve the problem. They're going to come in, they're going to bring, probably hoses with water, and they're going to extinguish the fire, and job done. What I typically don't need is an N fireman coming in while my house is on fire telling me, well, Jeff, let me tell you about fire theory. You need a spark, and you need a fuel source, and you need oxygen. And, oh, by the way, here's some ways that we can separate those things to help you prevent a fire in the first place. No, I've got a problem that needs to be solved right now. So in this situation, what's needed? I need someone who's very tactical, right? I need someone who's going to come in and solve the problem. However, if my house isn't on fire and I'm very interested in preventing fires, it might make more sense for me to have an N fireman come in and give me that bigger picture to be able to say, look, here's the future state. We want to prevent that fire. Here are some of the ways that you can do that to eliminate the fire from happening in the first place. When leaders understand that they have preferences from those perspectives, the first thing they can do is say, I probably need to work on that more future state, more strategic thinking to balance my leadership style and effectiveness. That's step one. Step two comes down to who's on my team? Who am I trying to lead? And what are their preferences? Some people with an S preference want a linear approach. Here's step one, here's step two. This is how you do the work. People with an N preference prefer you saying, this is the state of work that I want you to deliver, and then they want to be allowed to go work on it. When you understand that simple change or that simple need by your team, and every team is different because it's made up of individuals, When you understand that need of your team, your ability to lead and manage goes off the chart.
That whole conversation was off the chart, Jeff.
Yeah.
I'm just sitting here, I'm sitting here listening and just grinning ear to ear because that is such good information. And you know that if you're talking, I could sit here for the next 6 to 8 hours with you and just dive through the Myers-Briggs stuff and have you explain more. But you know, because as you're talking about this, like that pegged my response when you're talking about the fireman
Yeah.
analogy. And what's funny is, you know, I know Ben well. He was the first commenter, and so I have a marriage proposal, so that's nice because he and I would would definitely complement each other well. But then he commented here. He says that's exactly the sort of fireman he would be. He is the sort of person that assesses. It's the 20,000 foot
Yeah.
view. Let me cast the vision. I mean, just absolutely spot on with how that breaks out. And so I think it's really powerful too, because as you're sitting and talking, I'm thinking to myself, that really is who I am. And not that it's about me, but I can't help. Like I said, I got a grin on the whole time, man. Going, that is who I am, and that's how I function on a normal, natural basis.
Right.
But like you said, nature versus nurture earlier, it really does take, and you know, I've had a lot of years in leadership, so it's easy to see when, hey, I got to step outside of my comfort zone because this is what that person needs. And so such valuable insight, Jeff. Like it's just so good. Some of the things that you brought up earlier, and we started in at the beginning, and I will encourage, again, if anybody is listening to this, here's the first and foremost. If you have not already subscribed to this channel to tune into this podcast, this is the sort of thing, what Jeff is talking about. Like, let's talk about some really tangible things that you can do to grow. And this is also the sort of thing, you're not connected with Jeff. I think I shared earlier, but let me put it up here on the screen. Certainly you can go to iBridged.com and check out more, you know, what your company does. This is sort of the mid-roll advertising right here, Jeff. Go and check out what Jeff does. But also on LinkedIn, you're on there it's linkedin.com/in/Jeff Harnois, which is JEFFHARNOIS. So for anybody that may be listening later, make sure, you know, I would encourage you, like, you're such a, I've learned so much from you already. And just in our early conversation when we were first connecting, and then certainly just now, it's very intriguing and very appreciated. So coming down to a couple of other questions, because one of the things that we talked about, like, hey, one of the things that you said is, hey, our iBridged, our company, we help to measure trust and conflict and sort of commitment, accountability, these things that we talk about in leadership. Like, these are all things, if you ask any leader, what are important things? Well, you got to have trust with your people. You got to know how to solve conflict. You got to be empathetic. You got to have people that are accountable. You have to make sure that you're committed and people are committed. And I said, well, how do you measure that, right? What's the measuring stick? Because I come from a sales background for many years. So it's like, okay, well, if I'm selling widgets, and I know if I sell one widget versus if I sell 10 widgets, like, what's the better job? You're looking for the result. So how do you measure the result of things like this when you're talking about what you stated was behavioral models that drive cohesion within an organization? And you can take this and run and start wherever you want, but these behavioral models that drive cohesion, I would say, how, first and foremost, how do you measure trust? And maybe how do you measure conflict? What are the things that you do to advise us of that?
Yeah, so the modeling that we use comes from a book, The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, written by a guy named Patrick Lencioni, right?
Just read it.
Awesome. And timeless. I put it up there with the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, by the way. And so that's the modeling that we look at. To your point, we hear managers and leaders talk about those behavioral attributes. And your question is, how do you measure it? And my question is, how do you operationalize it? We can talk about them in theory, about them being North Stars and things that we want to gravitate towards. But the real question is, how do you get there? And so we start with an assessment that does include a psychometric. In this case, it's the DiSC psychometric. So we understand the personality of the team and the map of the team. Where are people across the psychometric spectrum? And then we literally ask them to measure behaviors that drive trust and healthy conflict and that whole list. And so we start with that data and understand, how is the team scoring right now? And it's on a Likert scale, so 1 to 5. And then we get the aggregate of that number. And then we break down the individual behaviors, and we can say, here's how your team scores on trust today. And we can look at the data and see the behaviors that are either scoring high and contributing to a high number, or the ones that are scoring low that are contributing to a low number. Then what we do is we'll do a full day workshop, basically teaching them the behavioral model. What behaviors actually drive and create trust in the organization? What behaviors prevent trust in an organization? And then we hand that model off to the team. I often describe it as a tool set that I'm going to give to the client team to go build the house that they want to live in. And once they do that, then we come back, somewhere 3 to 6 months later, and we reassess and measure their progress. And we repeat that cycle until the team is operating at a level that they want to be at. A couple of things about team cohesion in this particular modeling. Anytime a team is coming together, think Tuckman's model, forming, storming, norming, and performing.
Okay.
Anytime you have a new individual, and specifically if it's a new leader to the team, even if it's an experienced or seasoned leader, when that person takes over a new team, it's a new team, and the team starts at the forming phase again. If you don't have a governing behavioral model, often what happens, and Mike, I know you're gonna recognize this as soon as I say it.
Okay.
If you don't have a common behavioral model that you can apply to that forming and storming phase, what ends up happening is, because you're figuring it out as you go, you end up creating what I call scar tissue. It's when you've crossed boundaries for people, and some personality types have a really hard time of letting those incidences or injuries go, and that then influences the cohesion on the team going forward. So I often tell people, if this is a new team or you're a new leader to a team, I can help you achieve a level of cohesion that normally takes years to build. I can help you do that in about 2 quarters.
Wow.
If it's a team that's been around for a while, getting that measurement of current state is a huge recalibration for them, because people have their perceptions of whatever's happening on the team and whatever the team dynamic is and how things are working. And then we assess it and we do the measurement of it. And many people are like, oh, I didn't know that we were so weak in accountability, or I felt like we had a good team and I felt like we had high trust, and this confirms it or affirms that. And so it's a really interesting calibration point to say, well, from a data standpoint, where are we really? So we do that assessment, we get a really good look at what's happening. And I think probably the most important component, I mentioned earlier that leaders talk about this, but they don't necessarily know how to operationalize it.
Sure.
When we do this assessment and we look at the actual behaviors that drive all 5 of those behaviors, it's a fantastic place from a leadership standpoint to be able to engage in conversations with your team. Right.
So I'm sitting here, Jeff, almost starstruck as I listen to you speak, because I'm just like, every time I ask a question, you just have so much great insight to share, and I can't even express my appreciation enough. I want to hang on something that you brought up, and when we're talking about behaviors, because you're saying, hey, what behaviors drive trust, what behaviors kill trust. Do you see that there are common threads in those behaviors, or do is it always the same behaviors? Are there some that are the same? Is it unique to an organization? What are some of those behaviors that you see? Hey, look, if we're going to advise you, and just sort of at a 20,000 foot view, we're going to advise you need to incorporate these behaviors. What sort of 2, 3, 4 behaviors would you advise for people to incorporate that you see as a common thread? And do you see that across the board?
Yeah. So in the modeling, and you'll reflect back to the book on this, trust as defined by Lencioni is driven by something called vulnerability-based trust.
Mm-hmm.
Vulnerability-based trust, in contrast to something we call predictive trust. Predictive trust is I continuously do what I say I'm going to do, and so you trust me that I'm going to do what I say I'm going to do.
Sure.
Vulnerability-based trust is less transactional, if you will, and more relational. I'm going to share something with you that might be deeply personal to me, that might also help you understand how and why I operate the way that I do, and you'll do the same for me. And we're going to create a connection based on that vulnerability that is really, really solid. I have to tell you, of all of the 5 behavior engagements that I've had with my clients, almost 100%, we have tears happening. And for some people, that makes a lot of people really uncomfortable, and I get that. And we create a space where it's okay. But the point is, when you reach that level of vulnerability and you're able to share with people on that level, here's what happens. And this is why it's so important. When you're able to connect with people through trust relationally, when we move up into conflict, which is the next behavior, all of a sudden conflict becomes the pursuit of the right or the best answer. It's no longer about, oh, can I trust this guy? And, do I have to put up defenses? One of the other models that Lencioni talks about around conflict as an example is something called artificial harmony. And artificial harmony is we're manufacturing a state of harmony because we've all been too far and we've all been injured or damaged because conflict went too far and it got personal. And as a result, we pull back and we try to avoid anything that looks like conflict. And as a result of that, we don't get the best answer. We get the easy answer. We don't get the best outcome because we got the one that felt the best. And so teaching people how to engage in conflict when it's based on vulnerability-based trust allows teams to really sort of get up and cross over that line, have healthy conflict. But because we trust each other, we know that it's not personal. It's not about you. It's not about me. It's about finding the right answer. And wow, does that allow us to get to significantly better places. When you have trust and you're able to have conflict with each other, then we make commitments that are sort of the common goal. We're going to commit to what we say we're going to do. When I was at Apple, we had this thing called the pocket veto.
Okay.
The pocket veto is everyone sitting around the table saying yes to whatever's being suggested, but really they mean no. But they don't want to say no because they want to have the conflict. They don't want to push back, but really they're not committed. And what happens there then is great ideas never see the light of day because people aren't actually committed. And so we work on the behavior around driving for true commitment, meaning we're going to fall back to conflict if we can't get the commitment right. And that's what we want to have happen. If you can't commit, let's work it out. Let's get that right. And then the next behavior on top of that is accountability. When you commit to something, we want to hold each other accountable that it's actually going to get done, which trickles all the way back down to the predictive-based trust that we've been talking about. Do what you say.
Sure.
Or conversely, if you're not able to get it done, that you raise a hand and say, listen, I got to reset expectations here. I need to shift my dates or timelines. Or even more importantly, Mike, and I hope you see the connection here to vulnerability-based trust, that you raise your hand and say, I need some help. Because there are personality types who feel like raising their hand is a sign of weakness, and that's how they operationalize it. And we've got to get folks over that to be able to have vulnerability-based trust so they can say, I need help now. I need it sooner before it becomes a crisis. I need to do it sooner so we don't have to go back and rework, which is super inefficient. We want to get it right the first time. And I'm willing to sort of put myself out there and go, oh, I need some help here. Sure. And then the final behavior is about really having collective and common results, or a common results orientation, because in most companies, there's the individual performance that you get measured on when you get your annual review, and compensation is often tied to that, bonuses and raises and maybe even promotions. how do we allow that to continue to happen, but also balance that with a focus on the common goals that the organization is striving for, which you may not get promoted on and you may not get additional compensation for, but are just as important at an organizational level to get done. And so that's kind of the long answer to your question about how
No,
we
I think
pull
it's
it all
great.
together. But that's the measurement component, and then how we teach it, and then how we operationalize against it.
No, I think it's really good. And a lot of what it comes down to is when you have those things, I think not only you have happier leaders, right? And when you have happier leaders, it's able to duplicate those things. And I always just, sort of try and recap here for everybody, especially if they're listening. Like, a lot of times we'll get going about what we know, and it is such valuable information. But when you have happier leaders, you also have happier employees, you have happier
Yeah.
followers or workers, and they're able to replicate those things. Again, like you were saying, you said, hey, these are the 5 things, right? Trust, conflict, healthy conflict,
Mhm.
commitment, accountability, and then ultimately measuring results.
Yeah.
um
Can I
how
can I
Yeah,
can
yeah.
I comment on the happier teams piece?
Yes, please.
Because you went there instinctively, and from my perspective, it's absolutely a home run, Mike. When we can reach team cohesion because we've got a common behavioral model, we understand individuals interpersonally, right? We put
Sure.
those two things together. You say happier teams, but what I see is teams that are actively engaged, and we're seeing a lot of disengagement today.
Oh
We're
man.
seeing, cohesive teams are sticky teams, meaning, undesired attrition, that particular dynamic falls off a cliff. So,
Sure.
yeah, higher engagement, lower attrition. And then if the company is really smart about it, they start talking about how they operationalize teams to cohesion in their recruiting practices. And from a talent
Interesting.
attraction standpoint, people who are considering, and right now, it's a very low unemployment market. Employees have it's a buyer's market for employees today.
Right.
How do you separate out your organization when you're looking for top talent? And this is one of those ways where you can say, we are building a culture of cohesion where everybody belongs and everybody's operating at their highest levels.
That No, I think that's really, really strong. And that's one of the interesting things in you know my, within automotive, because I've been in automotive for a long time, and it's interesting. I run, of all things, right, automotive sales and a call center on top of that, right? Two things that we often experience a lot of turnover. And you just put words to it. It is interesting because one of the things that we often do when when we're recruiting top talent is you sell the dream a
Yeah.
little bit. You sell the dream, not just of what's happening in the future, but what's happening right now in the company. And let me tell you about these people and why. Like, our average tenure in our call center is about 3.5 to 4 years, which is unheard of in a call center, but
Yeah.
also unheard of in automotive. And part of the reason for that, and again, you just put words to it, is it's like, okay, well, because we have a happy and engaged group of individuals, that when they move from being the individual to it is an engaged team, to be able to move forward altogether. So I think that's just really, really, really valuable information. um Sort of coming down the pipe here, we're about 45 minutes in, so I usually 45 minutes to an hour. The one last thing I wanted to touch on with topics that you brought up, I'm actually going to share here. On the level leadership, Tammy says it's all about vision. Without vision, you have no direction, nothing to strive for, and employees need to see how their work contributes to the vision. It's interesting because when we come up with the way that we speak, our verbiage that we use, like what Tammy's sharing here, she says, vision and employees have to see how their work contributes, right? So I agree with that. I think one of the key things is being able to communicate, sort of what you're saying, Jeff, too, is communicate across some of these models, so that some people, if they're not, and though that's a whole different psychological model, right, where we talk about visual, auditory, kinesthetic, that's another piece of a psychological model to tie on. But as leaders, I've always hung on that as well, where you go, hey, if we see something, right, and I'm constantly communicating the vision to my staff through sight words, if they're primarily an auditory person, if they're that different personality type, they might not be able to connect with that sort of thing.
Yeah, if I could take that just a tiny bit further,
Sure.
I want to go back to the sensing and intuition on the Myers-Briggs scale.
Mm-hmm.
The sensing types are much more aligned with what you just said. Sensing is really the five senses: what you can see, taste, smell, hear, and touch and taste. I'm not sure if I got
And
those
go
all
figure,
right.
I bring it up, right? Go figure, I'm the S that brings
Right,
it up,
exactly.
right? Okay.
And so to your point, how you receive information needs to be concrete, it needs to be tactile, and you're going to value and trust information that comes in that way. However, my N type, I don't have to have that. I actually can sort of see that visioning from a theoretical perspective. It does. I can hear it. I
Right.
can see it. Those kinds of things aren't as important to me in terms of me connecting with it. If I could
Interesting.
add one other thing to Tammy's comment, because she's right on point here in terms of vision, but vision isn't enough. Vision is never enough. Um,
Ooh,
one
gonna
of the
jot that
other
down.
one of the other models that we work with teams on is called VAE, Vision, Alignment, and Execution. So you can have the best vision in the world, but if you don't gain alignment with your stakeholders, with your employees, with your customers, with your developers, with your marketplace, if you don't work to drive alignment with your vision, it doesn't matter how good your vision is. When you get the vision right, and then when you get alignment right, then you can focus on the tactical level of execution, and everybody now knows what they're supposed to go do. Back to the personality type, for people with an S preference, they really want to know what are we doing here? What are the steps that we're going to take to get there? And for people with that N preference, they kind of want you to describe what the end state looks like, and then they'll fill in the blank. And so the execution point has to take in, that consideration as well in terms of how you operationalize it. When you get balance in those three, and then when you operationalize all three, you get a magnificent outcome. You get what you wanted in the beginning. When you don't have all three of those, your chances of getting what you wanted where you started may not be so high.
That's really good as well. Thank you. Um, Kind of coming down the pipe here, one of the things that you commented on was talking about executive career management. And you had a few points in here, right? Well, when it comes to executive career management, and the way I took that, let me just ask you, what did you mean by, when you're talking about executive career management? Is that like, hey, how do I move from where I'm at in my career to be able to continue to move forward? What are you going after in that sense when it comes
Yeah,
to your
it's
focus?
really sort of the whole spectrum from, I'm ready for a new job, to how do I get promoted in place? How do I reach that next level? And again, we always start with, where are you and who are you?
Sure.
And then we work to sort of set the goal, and then solve those. We shine a light on the blind spots, and then we also create some things. Notice how everything I just said was all sort of fluffy and theoretical, because that's my N at work here. Let me now bring it down to something that's a
Sure.
little more concrete and tactical.
Love it.
We work with, so let's say the need is a new job. We'll go
Okay.
in and assess that individual, finding out where they are on the S&N scale, finding out where they are on the JMP scale, all matter. We look at their natural state, and we look for those things that I call are your superpowers. They're naturally what you're good at. We want to make sure that we're bringing those into the conversation. We also want to then highlight your blind spots, so that when you enter the job market, you're able to sort of talk to both. That's the first thing. The second thing, though, which is maybe more important, is we treat our career clients as products that they're bringing to the marketplace.
Okay.
Now, notice that framing is very different from, I can do a job and you need someone to do a job, right? When we
Sure.
think of you as a product, what we're looking for then is, what is your value proposition to the marketplace? How do you add value? And the way that we get there, Mike, is we focus on impact. If you go on LinkedIn today and just pick people at random and look at their profile, what you're going to get is a really good description of what their job was.
Okay.
That's really common.
Absolutely.
Somewhat less than that, you'll see people who will throw some metrics up, like I accomplished this and it had this, this percentage of revenue or this percentage improvement of this or that. And the question that I always have, I hate to sound skeptical here, but my question is, so what? You had a 50% improvement in operational efficiency. My question about so what is because I don't know what that means for you. I don't know if 50% was good or not good because you haven't shared with me what the impact of that was. If you say to me something now like, I had a 50% increase in operational effectiveness, which allowed our margins to improve by 20%, which helped us hit our profitability goals for the year. Now, all of a sudden, I understand the impact of a 50% increase in operational effectiveness. Most people don't tell the whole story. They stop at the accomplishment and expect their audience to sort of make those connections. We help our clients sort of shift their thinking to focus on impact so they can then articulate their value proposition. That's not completely different for what we do for people who are looking for promotions. We want to change the way they think about their work because we want to change the way they talk about their work. We want them focusing on what contribution did you make to the organization, even though you want to talk about the tactical outcome. Let's talk about the big picture. Let's connect to the strategy, to the strategic goals of the organization, how you move the organization forward. I'll give you one more really quick example that may help. Sure. Because you're in the world of sales, I have a sales background as well. You see sales resumes and they always say something like 120% over quota. Well, right. Everybody says that, so you're no different than everybody else. You are the same as every other resume that I look at. So how do I distinguish you? How do I think of you as my top candidate? If you said to me, I was consistently 120% over quota, which enabled my organization to invest in opening new markets that allowed us to grow, now all of a sudden I see you differently. Like you get the whole picture, you understand where you have an impact, and more importantly, you're driving impact versus, I'm putting fingerprints on boxes and shipping them out the door.
Sure. Well, and you're driving impact on more people versus, what's your contribution to the organization? What's the contribution to the other people versus just, hey, here's what I did. I think that's one of the keys when you're talking value proposition, when you're talking about, you said, so what? Well, let me tell you what.
Right? Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
But I've said stuff like that when I listen to you speak, because there's a lot of times I'll be talking with people or I'll coach people individually, and you'll say, hey, they'll tell you what they've done, and it's like, yeah, but let me tell you, and they think they should be known for that, right? Well, I should be known for this thing, and it's like, yes, but nobody knows you.
So why the thing is important.
Yeah. So it's just like you said, so what, right? They have to tell you the what. Mm-hmm. I think that's really valuable. So as we come to the end here, Jeff, any final thoughts, any sort of final pieces of wisdom you'd like to share with the audience here? Because we're almost an hour in, sir. It just flew by for me, man.
It literally feels like we just started this conversation.
Absolutely.
I think the advice that I would give to folks, if you haven't been exposed to psychometrics, and there are some free ones out there that you can go get on the internet, start with getting that modeling around who you are. Understand what your preferences are, what your traits are, what your natural superpowers are as an individual. And then take it to that next level of trying to understand the same components for the people that you work with or around. The third step to that is really understanding, what do I do with that information? You saw me do it in our conversation today, Mike. I have a tendency to talk bigger picture and a little more theoretical. So I'm conscious of that. what I do now is I sort of do both. I'll start at that theoretical or conceptual level, but then I bring it back down to a tactical level so that I'm talking to everybody. And having that awareness, I think, makes communication effectiveness, again, go off the chart. I think interpersonal relationships go off the chart. So start with understanding who you are. Start with understanding how, or move to the contrast of who you are versus who everyone else is. And then think about how do you make those adjustments to connect with people more quickly and more deeply. There's one really easy technique that I'll share here with the room. It's called mirroring. Mirroring is where you don't have to think about all of the psychometric modeling and trying to figure out what am I seeing and what am I supposed to do with it. You can set all of that aside. And as you meet new people, just do what they do from a body language standpoint. If you meet people who are very expressive in the face and they're talking with their hands and there's lots of energy and activity, do that too. On the other hand, so that's what we see with extroverts. If you're coming across somebody whose body is generally kind of quiet, and maybe there's not a lot of modulation in their voice, do that too, right? Just mirror what you see. And then listening to the language. Are they talking about big picture, strategic, future state, conceptual kind of stuff? And that's not your lane, work to get there. If you see people who are very focused on process and steps and linear thinking and getting things done versus people who are more ideological, I ideate around everything. I'm looking for good, better, best. Just move to that place with them. So mirroring, do what you see. And what I tell people all the time is if you mirror, your body will viscerally tell you how best to connect with that individual, what they need from you. So that's the tip that I would leave with your group. Start today, practice it every day, and pretty soon it'll become automatic.
That's so good, man. And what's interesting, and I will bet people can hear this on the podcast in your voice tone, and I could see it from your conversation, is even as you're talking about those types, right? Because I'm very much an excitable, let's go, right? Talk with your hands and so forth. As you're talking about that, your body language is there. Your pacing increases. When you started to slow down, you said you have someone that's maybe a little more subdued. Your voice tone reflects that, and your body language changes. So you are clearly a master, Jeff, at that stuff. So
Thank you.
I appreciate you. Thank you so much for sharing your time, sharing your insight and your knowledge with everybody today. I appreciate having you on the show. And if you would just hang with me for a minute, I'm going to go ahead and take this out.
Okay, Mike, it was an honor to be here with you today. Thanks so much for the invitation.
Thank you. And that, my friends, is going to bring us to a close for another Leadership Toolkit. Thank you for everybody that took the time to tune in, for everybody that commented and shared thoughts. Do me a favor, if you're not already subscribed to the channel or you're not subscribed to the Leadership Toolkit page, please make sure and do that. Throw some thumbs up, throw some likes, and most importantly, if you know somebody that this show could make an impact on, please share it with them, because that's the whole reason I do this. That's the whole reason that we have these conversations, is to be able to grow not just you, but all of the people that are in your circle around you and that you influence. So I appreciate you. I appreciate your time. Hope we were able to add some value today. Thank you. And I will see you back here next week. Until then, be great.